speaking of Wall Street, campaign donations. So you're not taking any corporate money, all small dollars, 6,000 individual donors, 6,000 plus.
Yeah, we've organized over 6,000 individual donors, and we just crossed a major threshold. You're kind of getting a scoop here because we were waiting for the FEC deadline this Friday or so, but we officially crossed $100,000 in campaign contributions, and our average contribution is around $8 or $9 a piece.
That's unbelievable. So I doubt your opponent has really any small dollar donations, barely any, but his top donors, you're saying, are Big Pharma and Wall Street. He doesn't support Medicare for all.
Well, we've been, since entering the race, so previously he didn't. Now that we've entered this primary, and since we've entered this primary, we have pressured his co-sponsorship on Medicare for All, Fight for 15. He suddenly moved.
Oh, so he joined the Conyers bill, soon to be Keith Ellison bill.
Right. He doesn't champion it, though. He doesn't, and I think that's really important because right now where we're at is that Democrats are in the minority. And when the Democrats are in the minority, anybody can co-sponsor anything because it really has very little to no chance of passing. What actually matters is what gets passed when we are in power. And even when we had a Democratic president, a Democratic Senate and House, we still didn't get the DREAM Act. We still didn't hold Wall Street accountable. We still didn't get single-payer health care. And a lot of that has to do with the corporate influence in the Democratic Party and over the Democratic Party.
Do you have faith that in this new political climate that will spearhead a lot of the changes that progressives and, working class and middle class people want?
I think so. And you know what? We cast a lot of blame upward because a lot of our elected officials lack political courage. And we have a kind of a crisis in that no one is acting politically courageous in this era or in the previous era. But that all trickles down because our voters, we as voters need to have the political courage to say to even our own team as Democrats, you know what, if you're not doing the job, I need to be courageous enough to hold you accountable and vote for a new Democrat if you're not going to do the things that I voted you in to do. There's so much double talk around banking, and it's kind of like what you alluded to earlier, where Democrats are not going to win the big money game because as frustrated as we can be with some of our biggest big money Democrats, they still won't be as cutthroat and bad as the most brutal corporatist Republican.
Right, which I hate the false equivalence because one can be bad, but one is awful.
We're not calling these guys Republicans. We're just saying they're not good enough.
Right.
They're really not. And we're in a crisis in this country. And when we are at this point, the point that we're at, we cannot afford to have wishy-washy Democrats in power. I'm sorry, I'm just gonna say it because this whole idea that a better deal and advocating that getting 10% better when our situation is sliding 50% worse is some kind of acceptable solution is wrong. These guys out here in the Republican Party are on a radical agenda to dismantle government. And here on the left, what is our current centrist response? Oh, let's make college just this much inexpensive. That's not the appropriate response. We need to have a bold, full-throated labor movement. We need to organize immigrants in this country. We need to organize working-class Americans in this country. We need to organize on a radical, bold agenda that people will actually want to get out of their house, vote, knock on a door, make a phone call for. I don't think there was ever really a fair post-mortem of the election. There was a lot of infighting over the primary and tit for tat and all of that stuff. But if we don't acknowledge the things that Trump did right to win the election, then we're never going to learn.
Oh my gosh, did you just say Trump did something right? See,
he did.
Right, I know, but the Democrats won't acknowledge it. That they won't.
The thing is like, and listen, Russia absolutely played a role in this election. I am fully supportive and believe in the protection of Mueller in this investigation. They absolutely played a role, but he didn't get to that 45% entirely from Russia. We need to acknowledge that in the Republican primary, Trump was the most liberal candidate. Trump ran on health care. Trump ran on infrastructure. Trump ran on jobs. He was lying through his teeth the entire time.
Anti-interventionism, and now he has John Bolton as his national security advisor.
Exactly.
Prime example.
He ran against the TPP. He was lying through his teeth the entire time, but he was talking to working class Americans. He was aggressively targeting his resources in blue-collar workers, in the Rust Belt, and winning these folks over. And I'm a member of the Democratic Party. I believe that the heart of the Democratic Party is in advocacy for working class Americans, but that we can't quit on that. We can't. That doesn't mean that we don't campaign in Wisconsin. It doesn't mean that we give up. And again, like if we just stick our heads in the sand and don't acknowledge the things that the messaging that was effective for Trump, then we're never going to learn. And we're never going to win again if we don't acknowledge that we have to be very bold and aggressive in standing up to Wall Street, in standing up for working class Americans. It's just not going to happen unless we do the difficult Band-Aid rip of saying, hey, these are the things he did better than we did.
Sometimes I think the Democratic Party tries to relate to communities by just putting someone that looks like them or has a similar last name to their, community to kind of gloss over actually representing them. I just was wondering what your thoughts were on that, and if you think it's a real phenomenon that needs to be, done away with.
Yeah, it's definitely a real phenomenon, and what's really difficult is that as an activist for issues that do touch certain ethnic communities, it makes my job harder because, for example, I routinely stand with Black Lives Matter of Greater New York, and I routinely meet with immigrant rights organizations and things like that. And New York 14 does have an authentic problem where our community is 70% people of color, and we've never had a person of color represent us in American history.
Wow.
And that is due to the traditional disenfranchisement of African American communities, traditionally Latino communities, etc. But when people talk about identity politics, there's a lot of different concepts that get conflated. So what identity politics traditionally has meant is running a brown person for a brown person's sake, just to say vote for me because I am Latina, for example. But we do need authentic representation of people who are standing up for marginalized communities, working class communities, and communities of color. For a very, very, very long time, we did not have elected officials speaking up on issues of police brutality. And it is a problem, and it is a part of gun violence in this country.
I think that maybe New York City is emblematic of a lot of the leeway that the Democratic Party has been given by some progressives and given itself in terms of its institutions. Do you see the party changing in terms of actually being a little bit more for working people since we saw this defeat in 2016? Do you have optimism about the Democratic Party?
I do. And the reason I have optimism about the party is because I have optimism about the people on the ground, the organizers, and I have optimism in voters in this country. And that's the reason why I have optimism about where our country is going. We now have major, traditionally super Wall Street funded candidates that have recently sworn off corporate PAC contributions. People like Cory Booker, who's known, Gillibrand, people
although she's more progressive than Booker.
Right. Booker is known to take tons of money from pharmaceutical corporations, and it's not like people think that a primary means you have to malign and like roll in the mud, and I don't think that that's what a primary is. A primary is an opportunity for a conversation. And if we go, for example, in New York 15, if we go 15 years without a conversation about the direction of our representation, then that direction goes awry.
Yeah. And civic engagement has just become, so much more at the forefront of people's minds in 2018. I was just at the March for Our Lives in Washington, D.C., and there were people walking around signing up people to register to vote. And do you think that 2018 we could see the House flip? I know that it would still be blue for you if you were to win, but do you see those tea leaves kind of going in the Democrats' favor?
I think so. It's going to take a lot because our country is very heavily gerrymandered. But hey, I once heard an analyst, or there was a quote from an analyst that said, what would it take for Democrats to win back the Senate in 2018? And the quote was, or like, where would those seats come from? And it was Arizona, Nevada, and an act of God, or something like that. And Doug Jones was our act of God in a way. There's no way anyone would think a Democrat would be elected senator from the state of Alabama. But and so I think that some of those surprises are possible. Pennsylvania, the recent gerrymandering ruling that forced the redrawing of these districts, I think has provided an additional advantage to doing that. So I certainly think it's possible. And if the country's going to get bluer in swing states, then it should get bluer in blue states too.
So New York has a history of some really shady politics when it comes to the Democratic primary. We know this from Bernie Sanders' primary against Hillary Clinton. Can you talk about some of the polling stations being closed in your area?
So it's really something else here in New York. The Attorney General Eric Schneiderman, he actually filed a case against the Board of Elections for gross negligence. And the New York Board of Elections admitted to purging over 200,000 voters in the 2016 primary. And what they found in the Queens County Board of Elections in specific, the Queens County Board of Elections used Ancestry.com as the basis for deleting voter rolls.
Wait, say that again?
The Board of Elections, this was in the briefing, the Queens County Board of Elections used Ancestry.com, just a random website, right, to justify clearing out the voter rolls. And this is what they did in part of purging voters. And this is how they cleaned their voter rolls, by using some random private website.
So this is how little the oversight the Democratic Party has in the state, that they can just use like what I bought when I was 19 to see, how Finnish am I? Spoiler alert, really Finnish. Yeah, that's unbelievable to me.
Yeah, and the other big thing that happens too is that a lot of people don't know that the Board of Elections is politicized. You have elected officials appointing people to head up and manage the Board of Elections. And so what we have going on right now is that there was just a brief filed to move a critical polling location in Queens out of a strong African American community that doesn't always vote with the establishment. And the only election that's coming up in Queens County right now is mine. So it is not unheard of. And this happens pretty often. It happens all over the city too. It happens in the Bronx, it happens in Queens, where these last minute polling locations, they'll try to move them, they'll move them back. A lot of the times it's to dissuade voters, it's to discourage them, and it's to confuse people.